Hi everyone, PV here and welcome to my new YouTube video. And today I'm going to talk about the 3 best decks in the historic format. Originally, I wanted to wait a little bit because Kaldheim just came out, so I wanted to wait to see if this set was going to change anything before doing this. But it turns out that I don't think there are many cards from Kaldheim that will actually impact historic in a meaningful way. So there are some cards that are good and will see play, but I think the top 3 decks will continue to be the top 3 decks. So let's get started. Here, unlike in Standard, I'm not going to order the 3 decks because I think Historic is a much more volatile format, which means that a deck that is 5% of the field in one day could be 15% the other. So it's hard to tell exactly which decks are the best. But I do think I would mostly play one of these 3 decks at any given point, depending on what the metagame is. And the first deck I have for you is Soultime Midrange. So there's been a lot of controversy over Soultime Midrange. Some people say it's a tier 1 deck, some people say it's a completely unplayable deck. And it has had very bad results in the latest tournament, but I think it's still a tier 1 deck. It's still one of the 3 best decks in the format. And the big thing about Soultime is that you can build it to beat anything that you want, right? I could create a Soultime configuration that is favored versus literally any deck in the format, which is not something that you can say about basically any other deck. Any other deck is going to have good and bad matchups, and Soultime is not like that. Soultime is a very highly customizable deck that you can build to beat whatever you want. So whatever change you make to your Soultime deck that makes it better versus aggro is going to make it worse in the mirror and worse versus control. If you want to beat a particular combo deck, that might, hurt your aggro matchup or your mirror matchup or your control matchup. So whatever changes you're making to your deck are going to pull in one direction or the other. And that means that Soultime is a deck that you can only play if you have a good confidence of what the metagame is going to be. So if the metagame is going to be wide open and I have no idea if people are playing, Gru Aggro or Gen Sacrifice or blue-white control or Soultime decks or 4-color midrange, it's very hard to build a Soultime deck. Which means that I don't think it's the best ladder deck. Because on ladder, people play everything. Right? You see a bunch of goblins on ladder, you see a bunch of auras decks, you see 9 lives combo, you see Paradox Engine, you see all the aggro decks, you see all the control decks, so you see everything on ladder. Which means it's very hard to build a Soultime deck to beat the expected metagame because the expected metagame is, 5 to 10% of everything. Which is different from a tournament. In a tournament, you can much more easily predict what other people are going to play, and then you can tune your Soultime deck to beat that. And the smaller the tournament, the easier that is to do. Which means that I think Soultime is a much better tournament deck than it is a ladder deck. The thing is, even though Soultime is a good tournament deck, that doesn't mean it's good for every tournament, because sometimes you just miss on what you expect the metagame to be. For example, in the last MPL split, players mostly figured out that other players were going to play Soultime. That Soultime was going to play the most played deck. I saw players who predicted, 70 or 80% of Soultime decks, which meant that everyone tuned their decks to beat Soultime, which created a very hostile environment to the Soultime decks. So the Soultime decks were all playing a bunch of main deck Narsets and Doom Whispers and Casualties of War, and they didn't have any sweepers, they didn't have Language, they barely had Extinction Event, which meant that they just got destroyed by the Gru and Gen players, which were more than expected. So Soultime was the most played deck, yes, but it was not the most played by the degree that basically everyone expected. So the Soultime players missed that metagame, which created a scenario in which they weren't even doing well versus the mirror because everyone was doing the same thing. Everyone was tuning their decks to beat the mirror. So even though you went to great lengths to beat that matchup, you're still 50-50 because everyone did the same, but they were bad versus everything else, which is why that deck did so poorly. But when you go back a couple more tournaments, we see that Soultime was the best performing deck because it hit the metagame correctly. Right? In the first of these historic tournaments, everyone predicted Goblins was going to be the big thing. It was the big thing. And then the Soultime players were correctly able to tune their deck to beat Goblins, and the deck won the tournament. So I think Soultime is still a very good deck if you get the metagame right, which is not very easy to do. Right? I was never confident that I could get the metagame right, which is why I didn't play Soultime. But I think the strength of the deck is undeniable, even though it is better on tournaments than on ladder. Right now, if I were going to play the deck, I would play this list, which is very tuned towards beating aggro decks. I think aggro decks are a lot more popular now because you have Gru and the Sacrifice deck, so there's 2 different spectrums of aggro decks, both very popular. And I think Languish is just the best card to have versus Gru in your deck, so that is what I'm playing here. You see I have also 3 Aether Gust, I have 3 Fatal Pushes, so it's just a bit more aggro-centric than normal, which I think is the correct way to build Soultime right now, but this could change in a week. right? In a week, you could just have a completely different deck with no languishes in the main deck and with Narsets in the main deck, for example, or Dune Whisperer. So when you're a Soul type player, you have to always keep ahead of the metagame. You have to know what people are going to play, and then you can build your deck to counter that. But if you get it wrong, it's going to be a disaster. And in the latest MPL tournament, everyone got it wrong, and it was a disaster. And the second I have a deck for you is Gru Aggro. And this is a deck that is very different from Soul type because it doesn't require you to predict the metagame at all. Because imagine you're thinking, well, I'm going to play against a lot of Soul type decks, so what's my plan versus them? Just going to play a bunch of creatures and attack them and kill them as quickly as possible. Like, oh no, I was completely wrong. There's no Soul type decks. It's all control decks and it's all other aggro decks, all goblins. Like, what's my plan versus those? Well, it's just to play a bunch of creatures and attack and get them at that as quickly as possible. So your plan is the same against everybody, which means that if you misjudge the metagame, it doesn't matter because you're trying to do the same thing versus everybody, which makes this a good tournament deck and a good ladder deck when you have no idea what you're going to face. I think this deck is very strong. It is the most powerful pure aggro deck in the format. I would say it's actually the only pure aggro deck in the format, right? Every other deck has some combo component in it. But it really is very straightforward. It is just about playing creatures and attacking and getting them dead. But sometimes it can be kind of complicated. If you want to watch the video that I did a couple weeks ago about one of my matches against Kanyoko Hero in the MPL split, I think it's quite an interesting game in which I'm playing this deck or a version that is similar to this. So I recommend checking it out. I'll post a link on the description. But yeah, this version, nothing really changes with Kaldheim in it either. I do think that Martin uses technology of playing Iron Crop Crasher is very good. So I'm playing 1 in the main deck and 3 in the sideboard, and I'm not playing any Collected Companies. I talked a little bit about Collected Company before. I think with this deck, you just want to kill them as quickly as possible in game 1, and Collected Companies doesn't do that for you, right? Sometimes playing a 4/4 haste or an Embercleave is much better than playing 2 4/3s, and that's the high end of Company, right? And this deck just has a lot of misses. Right? Even though it has a lot of creatures, it has a lot of cards that don't actually count as creatures later in the game. So if later in the game you play a Collected Company, you hit Llanowar Elves and Burning Tree Emissary, it's like you hit nothing, because you have no use for those creatures. So I don't like playing Collected Company in the main deck. I do like playing Collected Company in the sideboard, because I think the game has to slow down when you're playing against Soul type. Because they have so much removal, it becomes hard to Embercleave them. So I think Collected Company presents 2 different threats, and the instant speed part of Collected Company is also important because it helps you dodge sweepers. So Company is a card that I don't like in game 1, but I do like in game 2 versus Soul type specifically. And I do like it even more when you're bringing in Uncrop Crashers, which is a card that I completely missed and that Martin had, and that helps you get past, Nissa tokens, Uro, Doom Whisperer. So Uncrop Crasher is really your best anti-blocking card. And it happens to be quite good with Collected Company as an extra hit. So this is, I think, the best way to build the group deck right now. There's some divergence, right? Not everyone will agree with everything that I'm saying, but I think this is the best way to build it. And the third deck I have for you is Jund Sacrifice. So I've already talked a little bit about why I think Jund is a better version of the Red-Black Sacrifice deck. But just to recap, I think Collected Company is too strong in this deck. I think this is a deck that wants to find irreplaceable creatures. It's not like Gru, right? When you're playing Gru, you're playing Collected Company, you're hitting a 4/4. You could just have played a 4/4 instead. In this deck, you can't do that. I can't play more Mayhem Devils. I can play more Wolf Striders. I really want to find these cards, and Collected Company does that. On top of that, this is a deck that actually wants random bodies, right? It wants creatures to trigger Witch's Oven, Priest of the Forgotten Gods, Wolf Strider, Mayhem Devil. So hitting 2 random creatures later in the game still has a use. It's not like Gru where this is effectively a miss, right? Hitting a 1/1 is a miss in your Gru deck. It's not a miss in this deck because you just have use for any card that says creature in it. So I think Collected Company is just a very, very strong card in this style of deck, and I think it's worth playing green and paying any amount of awkwardness in your mana base to justify. That said, there are some new cards for Black-Red, so you could make a compelling case that Rakdos is a better version now. And namely, there is the Black-Red Pathway, right? It is a card that we were sorely missing in Standard and in Historic, and that is going to make the mana base significantly better. Before, I felt like the mana base from Rakdos wasn't actually better than the mana base from Jund. You just took more damage, but you were still unable to cast your spells the same amount of time, or roughly the same amount of time. You're not gaining that much from just being 2 colors. Now you are gaining a little bit more. You do have a better land, which means your 2-color mana base is going to be better. And you also get, some other cards that you might want to play, like Valky, God of Lies, which I think is a very interesting card. In the end, I still think Collected Company is worth it. I still think the green version is better, but it has narrowed the gap a little bit, and it is a point in favor of the straight black-red version. This is the version that I'm playing. You see that there are actually some Kaldheim cards, right? I'm playing pathways, 2 of the black-red pathway and 1 of the black-green pathways for both new editions. I don't know for sure that these are worth it, right? They do clash a little bit with the Czech clans. The Dragon School Summit doesn't work with them. And it's not a guarantee that the black-green pathway is actually better than Blooming Marsh. But I think having access to some number of them is still going to be better. There's no reason to play a basic Swamp. I think even if you have Dragon School Summit, it's just better to play a pathway at this point. Then I also have 2 copies of Valky, God of Lies in my sideboard. And I think they're worth trying, at least. Obviously, the set is quite new, so I haven't had a chance to try them a lot. I've played only a couple games. But I do think it is a strong card versus any deck with Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Because if you just play Valky and you steal their Uro, you can immediately pay 3 mana and attack the very next turn and already get a Uro trigger on top of dealing 6 damage. That's a super, super strong sequence, right? You get rid of their Uro, which was their plan all along for turn 3, and you present a game-winning threat yourself on turn 3. It's not even that easy to remove against some of the decks. Right, so I think this is worth trying. It is also a card that happens to be good versus Yasharn, right? You can just play, get rid of the Yasharn. Yeah, they can kill the Valky and get their Yasharn back, but it does add an extra hoop that they have to go through instead of you just losing to that card. Right, so I think it's worth trying Valky in the sideboard, and I do think that this sideboard is a little better in the Collected Company regard, because one of the big issues that we had with the card was that in games 2 and 3, you were bringing in a lot of instants, a lot of sorceries, and you were taking out creatures because that's just what's in your deck. You have to take them out, which made Collected Company a much worse card, right? Yeah, the fail rate increased a lot because you just cut 4 to 6 creatures in a lot of matchups. Having a Midnight Reaper and 2 Valkyries in the sideboard as well as the Reclamation Sage means that you actually get to board in some cards that keep your creature count high. So this is how I would build this deck right now. Obviously, some of the cards are also metagame dependent, right? The Line of the Void, do you want that or not? Well, are people playing Arcanist decks and Paradox Engine decks or not? And are they playing any other graveyard-based decks? This is very dependent on the metagame that you expect. So if you're playing a tournament, then you would have to change the sideboard to accommodate the expected metagame. But if you're just playing on ladder, I think this is the best version to play right now, and that's the one that I've been playing. That's what I have for today, but before I go, I want to say a special thank you to my 3 biggest early supporters, Geoffrey Whitehead, Mattia Giardini, and OCD. Thank you so much for supporting the channel while it's still in its infancy. And if you like this video, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR. It's totally optional, but there you can support my work a little bit more while enjoying some extra perks on top of it. And see you next week.